Welcome to Dialogue.
When we talk about science, the image that usually comes to mind is one of precision, rigor, and absolute objectivity.
Right.
We often view it as this perfect, sterile machine where facts are processed, vetted, and delivered disconnected entirely from the messy realities of human ambition or personal flaws.
That's the ideal, isn't it? The standard we hold science to. And it's a necessary aspiration. But the reality is that behind every data point, every major discovery,
Behind every paper.
every single peer-reviewed paper, and every expert you see quoted, there is a person, a human being operating within a highly competitive hierarchical structure.
And they have mortgages, careers, reputations to protect.
And very limited funding windows. That's a big one.
Precisely. This is the crucial human equation we need to confront today. Science isn't practiced in a vacuum. It's practiced by ambitious, sometimes fearful, often exhausted individuals.
And when you layer those very human emotions onto the systems, academic, financial, and institutional systems that are specifically designed to reward certain behaviors, well, that's where the problems start.
That's where the distortion creeps in. These systems often prioritize conformity over genuine, risky curiosity and compliance over critical courage.
So our mission for this deep dive is to investigate those relentless pressures, the perverse incentives, and the emotional realities that fundamentally shape how scientists behave in the 21st century.
We're really looking at the sociology and psychology of it all.
Exactly. We're moving past the data itself and looking at how the data gets made. And it's vital to stress this point. This is not about identifying villains. This is about understanding complex systems that make compromise almost unavoidable for otherwise principled people.
What's truly fascinating and deeply disturbing is the core paradox inherent in this structure.
Which is?
We demand that scientists be pure truth seekers, prioritizing objective reality above all else. Yet if a scientist reports null results or questions a dominant theory championed by a powerful figure, the system often imposes a catastrophic cost.
Their reputation, their livelihood.
Their entire place in the intellectual community. In that environment, even the most rigorous minds are forced into an impossible, career-defining calculation.
And that calculation is where the integrity of the process starts to fray. The system inadvertently creates an environment where silence about inconvenient truths is often a safer, a more rewarded career move than courageous honesty.
So true.
Let's unpack exactly how this works by diving straight into the engine room of the modern academic world, the immense pressure cooker of publication and career survival.
This is the notorious publish or perish mandate, and it has become the defining characteristic of the modern academic career. The core principle here is brutal in its simplicity.
It really is.
For career advancement, for tenure, for salary increases, and even for the simple retention of your laboratory space, the system overwhelmingly rewards output quantity over scientific quality.
You have to produce papers, and you have to produce them quickly. That's the bottom line.
It truly is a relentless treadmill. It places immense psychological and professional strain on every researcher, from the postdoc just starting out all the way up to the tenured professor trying to keep a major lab operational.
And the pressure isn't just to publish anywhere. It's to publish quickly and, crucially, to secure placement in those high-impact journals.
Yes, the top-tier publications.
Those are the currency of academia, right? They define your visibility, your reputation, and your ability to attract that all-important funding.
Think about the stakes for a moment. The difference between having a career that transforms your field and one that simply stalls out and ends quietly.
It can come down to a single paper.
It can often come down to securing that one high-profile paper in a journal like Nature or Science. If you go 2 or 3 years without significant visible output, your career trajectory can flatline.
And the grants dry up.
Grant funding becomes impossible and your team might dissipate. It's a very real threat.
So that intense desperation for rapid, high-impact output has to distort scientific behavior. It just has to.
It does. Instead of pursuing deep, complex, and potentially slow-moving inquiries, the kind that might take 5 years just to design the proper controls, researchers are incentivized to choose safe studies.
What do you mean by safe?
Studies where they can almost guarantee a positive, statistically significant, and easily marketable result.
Something with a clean, simple story.
Exactly. This is where we see the sacrifice of deep, fundamental inquiry for the sake of marketable, publishable outcomes. The pursuit of speed over scientific integrity leads directly into a series of dangerous consequences that erode trust.
I want to focus on how this pressure encourages researchers to overstate their findings. Because it's not enough to have a solid result, is it? You have to have a breakthrough.
You absolutely do. There is a clear incentive to juice up the narrative, to exaggerate the implications of the data.
How would that look in practice?
Well, perhaps by generalizing a result from a small mouse study to all of humanity, or making these sweeping claims of clinical relevance that aren't quite supported yet. You do it simply to pass that initial editorial gate and secure the journal's attention.
It's salesmanship.
And that desperation leads directly to methodological compromise. This is the subtle but widespread issue often grouped under the term questionable research practices.
And we should be clear, we're talking about cutting corners, not out of malice.
Not at all. It's out of necessity. It's driven by the calendar and the grant deadline.
Can you detail what those corner-cutting mechanisms look like in practice for our listeners? Because this is where the system's subtle pressure really manifests.
Certainly, one of the most infamous practices is what's known as p-hacking, or data phishing.
Okay, break that down for us.
A researcher might initially hypothesize that A causes B, but when the data doesn't quite show statistical significance, instead of scrapping the study, they start running the analysis again and again.
What are they changing?
They might incorporate different variables or exclude certain data points they label as outliers until they finally find a statistically significant relationship, often one they didn't hypothesize in the first place.
So instead of the hypothesis driving the data analysis is driving the rewriting of the hypothesis. That sounds like a textbook definition of backward engineering.
It is, and that leads directly to another practice called A-string.
Which stands for?
Hypothesizing. After results are known, you run the numbers, you find an unexpected significant correlation, and then you rewrite the introduction and methodology of your paper to make it look like that was your initial elegant hypothesis all along.
And this is common.
It's extremely common because it produces the publishable, clean story that those high-impact journals are looking for.
And what about sample size? We often hear about the need for a large number of subjects for a reliable result.
That's another casualty of the pressure for speed.
Yeah.
Researchers will often stop data collection the moment they achieve statistical significance, even if the optimal pre-planned sample size hasn't been reached.
Why is that a problem?
It maximizes the speed of publication, but it dramatically increases the risk that the finding is a false positive or just an artifact of chance. The methodological rigor is sacrificed for the sake of speed and that marketable p-value.
Here's where the systemic failure becomes most evident and, I think, most damaging to the scientific endeavor as a whole. The absolute avoidance of replication studies.
The bedrock of science.
Exactly. Replication, where independent researchers attempt to reproduce an existing finding, is the bedrock of scientific validity. If I can't repeat your result, is it even real?
Yeah, and this is the core of it. Replication studies bring virtually zero career reward. As you pointed out, you don't get tenure for confirming someone else's work.
You definitely don't get the front cover of a journal for publishing, "We replicated the finding of Dr. X."
No, replication is seen as career stagnation. It's a dead end.
So why would an early career scientist spend 2 precious high-stakes years of their already precarious professional budget painstakingly confirming a result, when those same 2 years could be spent chasing a new, trendy topic that guarantees a high-impact publication, even if the research is scientifically riskier or less necessary?
They wouldn't. The system actively pushes researchers toward chasing these trendy topics areas currently favored by large funding bodies or currently dominating the academic conversation. They do this even if the research itself is merely incremental or fundamentally less important than addressing crucial yet unfashionable foundational research questions.
It creates a tremendous, almost debilitating internal conflict. You hear this when you speak to researchers outside the formal structures of peer review and grant applications.
Oh, they admit this conflict openly.
They say they would design the ideal study completely differently, slower, more controlled, much more thoroughly powered, taking the time to refine every possible variable.
But the current system dictates that approach is too risky. It's too slow, it's too unlikely to generate the positive, significant results necessary for career progression.
And for that crucial next round of funding.
It's survival logic, the fear of unemployment and the closure of your lab, that overrides pure methodological scientific logic.
And that necessity for survival brings us directly to the second massive shaping force on scientific output: the invisible heavy hand of funding dependency.
If the publish or perish mandate is the academic clock dictating the pace, then grant funding is the financial oxygen tank that keeps the entire enterprise breathing.
We absolutely must stress the gravity of this, Grants are the essential lifeblood for survival. Without securing the next grant, labs shut down, almost instantly.
Equipment sits idle. The teams of graduate students and postdocs who rely on the principal investigator for their salary and training are dispersed. Careers end not due to incompetence, but due to a failure to secure resources.
So money isn't just a necessity. It becomes the primary shaping force behind research decisions.
It introduces what we call the alignment dilemma, particularly as funding often comes with specific, sometimes unspoken expectations, whether that's from government agencies, large private foundations, or most critically, industry groups.
You start to see a subtle alignment.
An almost unconscious alignment between a researcher's chosen goals and what they perceive their funders want to see.
And the problem begins long before this study even starts.
Yeah.
Back at the grant application stage.
Absolutely. Researchers are sophisticated. They know which topics are perceived as unfundable by their specific target bodies.
So if a line of inquiry seems likely to directly challenge or contradict the established interests, theories, or products of the major grant providers in that field,
that research simply doesn't get proposed. It is preemptively self-censored. The risk is too high to waste months writing a comprehensive 5-year grant proposal that you already suspect will challenge the existing paradigm the reviewers hold dear.
and the reviewers are their peers.
Often, the leaders in the field whose work might be challenged by your new, risky idea. The safest bet is to propose research that confirms, or at least incrementally advances, the established narrative.
And the stakes become stratospheric once the money is secured and the study is underway. There is a deeply rooted financial terror, an existential fear, frankly, of producing results that contradict the known interests of those who provided the funds.
Consider a scenario. An academic lab is largely funded by a pharmaceutical company to test the efficacy of a new drug or intervention.
Okay.
If the researcher delivers a strongly negative, a null, or a harmful result, that is not merely a neutral scientific finding. It is potentially the end of their relationship with that funder.
You get blacklisted.
Blacklisted from future contracts and potentially facing the rapid closure of their entire operation.
That pressure cultivates what the sources describe as a quiet culture of safety. Researchers often admit that they know what answer is safe long before the final data has been definitively interpreted.
They understand implicitly what narrative they need to deliver to satisfy the requirements of the grant cycle and secure that essential renewal.
This leads us to a crucial clarification about what compromise looks like in the context of funding pressure. We are rarely talking about outright data fabrication.
That's the extreme end, which is rare. More often, the compromise involves designing the study in a way that gently tilts toward the results necessary to keep the lights on and keep the team employed.
Wait, gently tilting sounds almost impossible to prove, yet incredibly widespread. How do researchers who are supposed to be trained in rigorous objectivity rationalize or execute this subtle manipulation?
They do it through choices. Choices made in the fog of methodological ambiguity. Think about selection criteria, for example.
How so?
They might unconsciously tighten inclusion criteria to ensure only subjects who are most likely to respond favorably to the intervention are allowed in the study.
Or the opposite.
Or, conversely, they might broaden exclusion criteria to eliminate subjects that showed an early, unfavorable response, rationalizing it as controlling for confounding factors.
So they are making scientifically defensible choices, but those choices are subtly influenced by the subconscious, overriding need for a positive result.
It's an exercise in methodological optimization.
Aimed not at comprehensive truth, but at statistical significance.
Exactly. Or consider the choice of endpoints. If a researcher is testing a medication, they might choose a slightly more subjective or intermediate marker, like a biological proxy measure, as the primary endpoint.
Instead of what?
Instead of a harder, more definitive, but slower and riskier endpoint, like mortality or long-term clinical outcome. They choose the measurement that is most likely to produce that necessary statistically significant result within the grant timeframe.
But then there's the sheer force of competition in the grant application itself, because resources are limited and thousands of labs are competing for the same finite pool of money.
You feel compelled to exaggerate the significance of your potential findings.
You have to oversell the concept.
Absolutely. You have to write a grant application that doesn't just promise solid research, but promises a game-changing breakthrough, a cure, a fundamental shift in understanding. It's aggressive salesmanship layered on top of scientific uncertainty.
You have to sell the impact just to stand a chance of securing the necessary capital.
You do.
And that hyper-aggressive sales pitch must shape internal expectations, doesn't it? Once a grant is secured based on the promise of a revolutionary breakthrough, even if the underlying data was always shaky, the pressure to deliver that promised breakthrough becomes immense.
It becomes absolutely immense. You've convinced yourself and your funders that the answer must be positive.
This internal pressure and external salesmanship lead us directly to perhaps the most intimate and often overlooked factor in scientific distortion: the intellectual tribe, the maintenance of reputation, and the power of the individual ego.
Reputation truly functions as academic currency, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It determines who sits on your thesis committee, who agrees to collaborate with your lab.
Who funds your next project, and critically, who reviews your papers favorably?
It is everything. In this hierarchy, a single misstep, a publicly unpopular or politically inconvenient view, or most dangerously challenging a powerful, established senior figure, can absolutely derail an early or mid-career scientist's trajectory.
Careers can be torpedoed that quickly.
Rapidly, by a handful of influential peers deciding you are not one of them.
This fear must breed intense institutional conformity, especially at the lower levels.
It does. We see early career scientists, graduate students, and postdocs quickly adopting the specific biases, the research approaches, even the statistical tools favored by their mentors.
And this isn't just about learning, it's about signaling loyalty.
It's about ensuring loyalty to the existing successful intellectual paradigm. They learn very early on that their future, their recommendations, their postdoc placement, their first academic job depends entirely on aligning seamlessly with the established intellectual hierarchy of their lab and their field.
So, dissenting views, even if they're based on sound data, are softened.
Or entirely withheld from public discussion. Imagine you're a junior researcher, and you gather data that contradicts the dominant theory in your field, a theory championed perhaps by the editor of the major journal you hope to publish in.
You're not going to trumpet that finding loudly.
You're far less likely to. Peer pressure acts as a homogenizing force. Challenging the status quo risks significant professional exclusion.
What kind of exclusion?
You risk losing collaborators, being shut out of vital informal networks where grant ideas are exchanged, or, most directly, finding your carefully prepared manuscripts consistently rejected by journal gatekeepers who are emotionally invested in the theories you are questioning.
The ultimate result, then, is the development of powerful orthodoxies within specific scientific fields.
That's a good word for it. They aren't just prevailing theories, they morph into almost religious dogmas, intellectual bunkers that actively discourage genuinely new, challenging, or paradigm-shifting ideas.
Especially ideas that might require the field to fundamentally re-examine its past 30 years of work.
The system, through its senior members, protects what is known and comfortable, often at the direct expense of what could be known. And that protection mechanism is often powered by the raw, defensive force of individual ego.
Let's delve deeper into this concept of intellectual identity. When a researcher spends decades building an entire career around a single model, a specialized technique, or a particular theory.
Perhaps they pioneered the field, perhaps the model even bears their name.
Right. What happens when truly new, contradictory evidence surfaces?
It ceases to be a professional critique. It becomes a profound, personal, and existential threat. That new data threatens to invalidate not just their work, but their entire professional identity.
It must trigger a deep, visceral fear.
A fear of admitting that decades of foundational assumptions, which led to grants, awards, and status, might have been fundamentally incorrect.
And when that fear is triggered, decision-making shifts from empirical reasoning to emotional defense.
The scientist is no longer debating data. They are defending their life's work. This is where you see highly rational, brilliant minds engage in irrational behavior.
For example,
They may resort to outright dismissal of contrary evidence, often based on extremely trivial or selectively focused methodological flaws. Or they might launch aggressive personal and professional attacks on competing scientists who propose rival models.
the irony is staggering. Science is fundamentally built upon questioning assumptions, embracing uncertainty, and constantly revising its understanding of reality.
Yet the human ego struggles desperately against uncertainty. It's hard to let go of the intellectual authority and status that comes with being the expert in a field when the evidence suggests that field needs to shift beneath your feet.
So a scientist's emotional, personal investment in their established intellectual identity can inadvertently become one of the greatest barriers to genuine scientific progress.
They have become prisoners of their own success.
So if the intellectual tribe and ego are the internal drivers, we have to also look at the even subtler forces at work. the unavoidable cognitive biases, and the institutional cultures that allow them to flourish unchecked.
Let's begin with the inescapable fundamental truth. Scientists are human beings. They are susceptible to the same psychological shortcuts, the same mental errors, and the same confirmation-seeking behaviors as every other person.
And we should stress, these distortions are rarely acts of deliberate corruption.
Not at all. They are simply human flaws manifesting within the rigorous environment of the lab.
And the most dominant player in this game is confirmation bias. Can you walk us through how this manifests practically, beyond just saying seeking supporting evidence?
Of course. Confirmation bias is the subconscious tendency to seek out, interpret, and favor evidence that already supports your existing hypothesis, while simultaneously downplaying, ignoring, or scrutinizing contradictory evidence with far greater rigor.
So let's say a researcher is running an experiment and has 20 data sets.
Right. They might subconsciously be more inclined to spend time manually rerunning statistical tests on the 3 data sets that show unfavorable results, looking for a valid reason to discard them as outliers or errors.
While accepting the 17 favorable data sets at face value without that same intense scrutiny.
Exactly. It influences everything from the way data is visualized to the selection of data filtering parameters. Then you have selection bias,
Which is where the sampling process is skewed.
consciously or unconsciously, to improve the odds of getting a clean, positive result. If you're testing a drug, you might inadvertently advertise for volunteers who are already slightly more optimistic about the treatment, skewing the overall cohort from the start.
And we can't forget motivated reasoning. That's where the researcher's desire for a specific outcome.
Like securing that next publication or justifying the last round of grant funding.
That desire subtly influences how ambiguous data is processed or interpreted. The brain fills in the gaps with the answer it wants to be true.
We also frequently see the power of anchoring. Researchers can become anchored on early, promising results, perhaps the successful findings from the first handful of trials.
And they internalize that initial success.
They do, and then they interpret all subsequent, potentially less favorable data through that initial, optimistic, and often unwarranted lens. The initial positive signal becomes a psychological mooring.
And of course, there's the classic simple human error of overconfidence in one's own predictive model.
Which leads to an unconscious, unintentional cherry-picking of data points that reinforce the model's perceived validity, while data that challenges the model is treated as noise or experimental error.
These aren't spectacular, deliberate deceptions.
They are the subtle, everyday ways that human psychology intrudes on the objective ideal. If the scientist is not hyper-aware of these internal biases, and if the surrounding institutional culture doesn't actively guard against them through blind analysis and registered reports, an entire field of inquiry can be distorted without a single malicious act taking place.
And that leads us directly to the survival culture, how the institutional environment shapes and amplifies these human tendencies. Scientists don't operate in isolated bunkers. They adapt to the culture of their lab and their academic department.
And if a lab is run by a high-pressure principal investigator who bases their entire hierarchy on the volume of publications, or if the academic department signals that only successful positive results are valuable currency for tenure,
Behavior shifts immediately.
the goal transitions from truth-seeking to productivity optimization.
Labs can and do cultivate silence regarding uncomfortable truths. You learn quickly not to bring the negative or null results to the weekly meeting.
You focus solely on what is working, on the most promising lead, because you know your PI's reputation and funding depend on positive momentum.
This creates a clear, unspoken expectation. You must produce positive results that lead to high-impact publications. This is no longer pure scientific objectivity.
It's a complicated, fear-based productivity game driven by internal politics and hierarchical pressure, where the pursuit of truth is secondary to the pursuit of the next publication credit.
When every single signal, from the mentor, from the journal editors, from the competitive funding body, indicates that honest reporting, especially if it involves non-significant or negative findings, is a high-risk career move.
Then compromise stops being a moral failure and becomes a necessary survival strategy. It's an act of professional self-preservation in a brutal zero-sum environment.
But what happens when that calculated compromise isn't enough? What happens when a scientist sees outright verifiable wrongdoing, systematic fraud, or a deep institutional cover-up, and they decide that their moral and professional obligation outweighs their instinct for career survival?
This brings us to the catastrophic cost of courage.
The reality of the scientific whistleblower is perhaps the most sobering aspect of this deep dive. The cost of speaking out against misconduct, or even just against institutional complacency or flawed, powerful orthodoxies, can be, well, catastrophic,
Yeah.
often total.
We have to emphasize this. The system, the very institutions meant to uphold scientific truth and rigor, often acts, whether consciously or unconsciously, to protect its own reputation, its funding stability, and its existing structures over the individual seeking to correct the record.
The losses faced by scientific whistleblowers are steep and frighteningly comprehensive. They often lose their funding instantly as the institution isolates them or their grant is terminated.
Future job opportunities dry up because hiring institutions, rightly or wrongly, are intensely wary of bringing on someone deemed a troublemaker or a source of controversy.
They frequently lose publishing access, finding themselves effectively blacklisted by journals whose editors are peers of the accused or are simply afraid of publishing content that disrupts the established narrative or financial pipeline.
And the professional reputation, built over years, is decimated, often replaced by labels like disgruntled, unreliable, or unprofessional.
And beyond the professional consequences, the personal toll is devastating. We're talking about profound damage to personal relationships, the loss of lifelong collaborations, and significant, long-lasting detrimental impacts on mental and physical health.
The stress and isolation of fighting institutional power is immense. When you stand up to an entire field, the retaliation is rarely centralized in one place, but it is pervasive, isolating, and financially ruinous.
So the core conflict boils down to the impossible choice a principled scientist is forced to make.
They must weigh the undeniable need to correct the scientific record, to uphold truth against their entire career trajectory.
Against the financial stability of their lab employees who depend on them, and the financial security of their own family.
It's an impossible choice.
The system's reaction to whistleblowers sends a chilling, undeniable message across the entire academic landscape. Don't disrupt the powerful narrative. Maintain silence.
It is an incredibly powerful, financially enforced deterrent that encourages compromise far more effectively than any internal ethics policy encourages honesty.
The harsh, difficult truth is that many individuals who speak out effectively vanish from their fields entirely. They disappear, not because their allegations were incorrect or unfounded,
Often they were proven right years later.
but because they were simply inconvenient to the powerful figures, institutions, and funding structures that prefer stability and continuity over disruptive correction.
It provides a necessary reminder that science is not ultimately defended by institutional guarantees or governmental oversight committees or abstract philosophical ideals. In the real world, it is defended by solitary, courageous individuals willing to stand alone and absorb the punishing cost.
And if the system continues to allow those costs to be so high, the truth will always be threatened.
We've now mapped out the intricate network of pressures, financial, professional, ego-driven, and psychological, that lead good, intelligent people to compromise the objectivity we inherently cherish in science. We have seen how the macro pressure of publish or perish feeds the micro conflict of ego and cognitive bias, and how the entire structure enforces silence through the threat of the catastrophic cost of courage.
The synthesis is stark and incredibly relevant to everyone who relies on scientific expertise, which is all of us. If the individuals producing the foundational knowledge we depend upon, in medicine, environmental science, technology, public health, are subject to these constant, grinding, and career-threatening pressures.
It fundamentally and materially impacts the quality, the reliability, and ultimately the truth content of the information the public receives.
The human element is the necessary but often compromised gatekeepers in the scientific process.
This leaves us with the crucial, overriding question for you, the listener, to consider. If the cycle of systemic distortion continues because the very structure of research rewards quiet conformity and punishes dissent, punishes courageous truth-telling, more fiercely than it punishes deception,
then how confident can we truly be in understanding the truth provided by these powerful, self-protecting institutions?
this systemic pressure ultimately defines not just what research is done, but which information makes it out of the lab, passes peer review, and enters the public consciousness.
It transitions the act of science from a pure search for reality into a highly filtered, manufactured narrative shaped by powerful incentives.
And that transformation, how society interprets, misinterprets, and applies the science it receives, often guided more by carefully crafted narratives than by pure evidence, is the next logical step in this conversation. A deep dive for another time.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that that you would like covered in a future video.